So today we have with us Chaitali Sen, who is a wonderful writer and a friend, and I'm so excited to have her here to talk to her. Chaitali is a writer and educator based in Austin, Texas. Her debut novel, The Pathless Sky, was published by Europa Editions in 2015. Short stories, reviews, and essays have appeared in Ecotone, Shenandoah, New England Review, New Ohio Review, Colorado Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, Catapult, Lit Hub, Electric Literature, Los Angeles Review of Books, and many other publications. She is a graduate of the Hunter College MFA program in fiction and founder of the interview series Borderless, Conversations in Art, Action, and Justice. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Chaitali, if you could tell us what it is that you're going to read for us today.
So I'm going to read from a short essay that I wrote for Boulevard magazine that's coming out shortly. They asked for a symposium on little known facts about history. So I wrote about part of my family history and the Indian independence movement. So it's about the year 1943, the Women's Regiment of Subhash Chandra Bose's rebel army. Every family has a prevailing mythos about the role they played in history. It becomes a kind of origin story. Anything that happened before that moment falls away. On my mother's side, that story begins with my grandmother's enthusiasm for the rebel army to which she sent her 2 teenage daughters. My grandparents were Bengali expats living in Burma, my grandfather serving as a physician to the Burmese Prime Minister's family. In 1943, their paths crossed with the nationalist leader Subhash Chandra Bose when he came to Burma after a failed experiment in Berlin. He called on Indian families in the area to enlist their daughters into the all-female Rani Jhansi Bahini, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment of the Indian National Army. Thus, my 2 eldest aunts, aged 14 and 17, went off to boot camp, proving we were willing to fight to the death for India's freedom. It was always strange to hear my demure mother talk so fondly of the militant history into which she was born. Bose is honorifically called Netaji, leader, and at 3 months old, my mother played baby Netaji in a stage play. Reportedly, she cried during her entire performance. In 1945, when she was just a toddler, her sisters came home from their preparation for battle and took on the domestic chore of helping my grandmother run her household. I never knew my grandmother, but like Bose, her legacy is controversial. She was married at 13 to my grandfather, who was in his 20s, and had her first child at 16. She never received a formal education and by all accounts was not that interested in mothering. In their old age, 3 of my aunts spoke in coded but bitter words about her, with only my mother left to defend her as someone who had many talents and sought various avenues for her considerable intellectual gifts: embroidery, dressmaking, chess, cooking, building construction, driving in the streets of Calcutta no less, and while it lasted, the armed overthrow of British rule. The aunt who was 14 when she left home to become a soldier now lives independently in an apartment in Kolkata. She has lost touch with reality enough to insist she is 100 years old instead of her actual age of 90. She gets a pension from the Indian government for her service to the INA and talks often of her time in the Rani Jhansi regiment, though much of it is incoherent. She repeats one story of leaving the camp for an outing when their car broke down. Forced to walk back, they passed Netaji's house and were invited in. He spoke to them warmly and fed them a little rice. There wasn't much since everything was rationed, before sending them back to the camp. The next day, they received a letter from him citing a dress code violation. All the girls had been wearing sandals instead of combat boots. A few years after Bose's death, India's birth as an independent state was convulsive and bloody, with partition creating one of the largest mass migrations in human history and killing more than 1 million people. Decades after Gandhi and Bose argued about the road to freedom, The question of what freedom is and how we get there still hovers in the suffocating air. The whole world wants to know, how do we get free? When do we get free?
Wow, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So that's coming up in Boulevard soon.
It'll be in the fall issue. I'm not sure if it's coming out in a few weeks or next month, but it's upcoming.
Awesome. Is this the same grandmother that you've written about before?
Yes, it is.
It is. So it seems like, I mean, there's sort of a tradition, or maybe we can call it inheritance of, being standing up for something, a little activism in your family. How much of this were you aware of as a child, and how much of this has impacted how you've become as a writer or as a person?
Yeah, I really wasn't aware of it at all as a child until actually we went to see the movie Gandhi when it came out. I don't remember what year that was, but one of the few family trips we took to the movies was to go see Gandhi. And it wasn't playing in our town. We had to go one town over. And, actually until that moment, I really didn't know much about Indian history at all. And on the way home, or, after watching the movie, as my mother was processing it, she started to tell all these stories about a different road to freedom that her family was involved in, which was this militaristic armed overthrow. And my aunt in London, who we spent quite a bit of time with, was the older aunt who went to the boot camp. So as a teenager, I tried to interview her about it. And my aunt in India, I spoke to a little bit more on my last trip. But, over in my adult years, I've been trying to piece together some of this story. And did I think that it had anything to do with like me becoming an activist, or my sister, who's also an activist? I guess, it must have some effect. There is obviously some kind of hunger for, and ending oppression, whether it's completely thought out or not. I think my grandmother kind of fell into this. I don't know that if she hadn't met Bosch in 1943, I don't know what she would have thrown her intellect into, but I think it's a combination of accident and desire.
Right. Well, so changing gears just a little bit. I mean, we're talking about activism. We come back to what you do in real life for a second. But if we talk about art, and we talk about you as a writer, how do you see the role of activism or dissidence? Like, what role does literature have in creating these spaces, or reclaiming spaces, or just claiming spaces for the first time? Or removing the kind of violence that maybe has been imposed upon South Asian cultures, let's say, by other literature?
I mean, that's a very good question. And I think there's a lot of layers to it. One, I don't think there can be any movement for independence or revolution or social justice without literature, and without poetry, without novels that actually get people into the main thinking and passions and contradictions of any struggle. So I think literature is extremely important. And, I'm not an expert, but I think people like E.M. Forster, even writing about India, had an effect on the eyes of the world on that movement, and what that meant for like colonies everywhere also. And then there's also just the imposition of English, the English language on the subcontinent and what that's done to native language literature. But, you know, of course, people know a little bit more about like Bengali literature as opposed to other literatures in the subcontinent, but that there's all this beauty and poetry and, you know, different ways of looking at the world in these other languages that the world is deprived of. Even people in India, I'm sure this is probably true in Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. Like many people are not even literate in their own native language. So, you know, there's a lot of literature that's to this day still deprived, that people are still deprived of. But as far as like you know, giving light and breath and substance to any movement, I think literature is crucial. I don't think you should want to have a movement for liberation where literature isn't valued. I think it's one of the things about, you know, if I can get like super political for a minute, one of the things about Trump here and that movement of, you know, America First, MAGA, Make America Great Again, is that there is no literature. There is literature, words, you know, anything artistic is not valued at all. And, you know, I think we have to stand for the best of human achievement, and literature is among them. And, you know, the last thing I'll say about this is, you know, sometimes I do think, well, what's the point of being a writer right now? That there's so much else to do. But a friend of mine who is an activist said she never would have become an activist if she hadn't read Toni Morrison in high school. You know, so you don't know where the effect actually takes hold, but you need a very vibrant, body of literature, I think, to really give a social movement a lot of backing.
So one of the things that I find interesting, and I mean, I should mention, so you run an interview series which is called Borderless.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to actually ask you about that in a second, but on this topic, one of the things that I find intriguing is, you know, we're talking about South Asia and writing coming out of South Asia, but South Asia itself is such a bordered society.
Mm-hmm.
Not, I mean, you know, I'm from Pakistan, you're from Bangladesh. Now, historically speaking, like if we think about literature, you think about languages, you think about identities, people really separate themselves from each other just based on these very small things. So I'm curious to hear what you think about the idea of how these borders affect, you know, the transfer of sort of art or literature between South Asians, and what this means for our growth as an area, as a, you know, as a area of the world.
You know, well, I will say that I fight for a world without borders, and I think that the borders that have been set up, I mean, and you know, these borders were wrenched out of a very bloody history of invasion and then, you know, colonialism. And like Bengal at one point was one state and then split into two, and then that became, you know, Bangladesh and West Bengal and India. You know, there's a distinction between national or ethnicities and languages and these false political borders that are so damaging, I think, to humanity. They're just, you know, just fodder for wars and hatred and bigotry. So I think actually in the art, as writers and as artists, we are actually at the vanguard of breaking down those borders. That is why I called the interview series Borderless. I think that, you know, humanity actually has to get beyond a world of borders if we're to survive. I actually do think that our survival depends on that. So I do think that it's, that was one of the great things about New York in the 1990s when I was first moved there as an adult, where South Asians of many different backgrounds from all different countries were, we're actually forging this South Asian identity, and, learning a lot about each other through that process. And that really does have to become more of the ethos but we're in a time actually where borders are being more fortified when they need to be actually coming down. And so I think that artists, writers have to be at the forefront of saying, we respect the language that you speak, we respect your religion, but we're one people, we're all part of humanity, and we need to love each other in that way. And the interesting thing about, I don't know, there's an interesting push and pull where, the push for more borders has actually also flattened everything more, so that it is somewhat a reaction to like English being spread all over the world, or it's a reaction to this colonialism too, where the particular things that make each culture beautiful are getting undermined by just the way the world is right now, where more and more people are not speaking their native language. More and more languages are dying, right? So this is part of how capitalism works, and is sort of flattening and homogenizing everything, while making people want to put up walls around them.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know what avant-garde means to you. Like, what does the avant-garde tradition in literature mean to you, and what does it mean in a South Asian context?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not an expert on avant-garde, but I think when I was in college, I just thought avant-garde was anything that was weird and hard to understand. But I think of it more as like, in politics, you have the Vanguard Party, the radical left communists. And what that means is that you're in the front lines, you're the cutting edge that's forging a new path, that's forging a path, hopefully that's liberating and emancipating for humanity. So I think it's useful for me to think about avant-garde in that way, that these are the artists who are really not afraid to try something new, but are really thinking about what's the way forward for their art, or for this artistic movement, or for the liberation struggle of their people. But it's about forging a path forward. So that very new and experimental forms can come out of these avant-garde movements. I think that goes with actually trying to find a new way forward, or finding a way, looking ahead instead of looking into the past. And I don't. There's so it's almost as if all art that came out of like colonial South Asia had to be avant-garde, because you're breaking this mold of what you're supposed to be doing, being submissive being part of this colonial empire. So these artists like Tagore actually really uh, forging and putting a stamp on Bengali literature and Bengali identity, I would say is avant-garde. In cinema, there's been a lot of, I think, Satyajit Roy um, as a filmmaker, and the Mrinal Sen, who died a couple of years ago, that these are avant-garde filmmakers. One, because of how they were making film, and two, because they were actually putting um, film that from film about a people that was not considered important in the world, that they were putting that out there, putting those stories out there. So I think, to me, South Asian avant-garde is about telling the world about these people that are important, that their lives are important, and that they actually played a historic role through their independence struggle. As as much as we can argue about where that ended up and the shortcomings of it, they made it. They played a historic role in actually bringing down the British Empire. So, uh, I guess that's my idea of avant-garde.
But speaking of novels, so for people who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about your last novel? And then I'm kind of curious, because one of the most interesting things about that, or the most noted things, I think, talked about things, is how it's set, a place that's without a name,
Mhm.
which I find very interesting, just given, the idea of identity and sort of claiming
Mhm.
space. So if you could start with
Mhm.
telling us a little bit about the novel.
Yeah, so the novel's it's a love story. It's a set in a fictional country, and it's about two people who are from different ethnic backgrounds, different class backgrounds, who live in the same country that has a lot of different border issues and a lot of different rebellions that have seeped up through the centuries. So these two people fall in love, but they find that their relationship is very much affected by the history of their country. And so Mariam, comes from a province that has a very contentious history with the capital, I guess, of the country. And there was an insurrection, rebellion, civil war, different ways of thinking about it, and that province was brought under occupation, was brought into the fold. And a lot of this was inspired by things going on in India when I was growing up, like the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, the Punjabi separatists, and Tamil separatists, and you know different kinds of language struggles and things like that. Um, and then um, John, who is from an upper class family from the capital, um, they find that in the course of their relationship that there are fissures that don't have as much to do with them as with the history of the country, and these like bigger conflicts um, that keep bubbling up to the surface. And then as they get married, as their relationship continues, these become more acute to the point where it could either break them or push them closer together. And then they have to make a choice about which direction they go in and what they do. So that's the novel. And this was what was on my mind. I could not set that story in America or in India, because I actually did not like to do it in India. I didn't have enough knowledge and authority to write about that country. I haven't lived there since I was 2 years old. I have not gone back and visited a whole lot. And then I didn't really want to write it about Americans. I didn't want it to be about Americans. So I made up a country, and that was very liberating. And, you know, whatever marketing problems it caused, it was all worth it. And, you know, I think that this story is something that can happen in many, many places around the world. So.
Well, that's one of the things, because when I was reading up about the novel, that point came up a fair bit about how it's in a nameless country, and I was curious. I mean, whether that was sort of a deliberate, because in some interviews or not interviews, I think some articles, it was sort of guessed at as, you know, it's unapologetic in the sense of you're not going to give sort of an expected understanding of, well, it's this part of the world, so of course this makes sense. So was this and sort of resistance to that kind of an idea, or was this just, or was it something else?
I think it was a combination. I mean, one, it was, I have a story in my head. I want to get this novel out, and I just need to do it. I didn't want to be told that I could only write about this or this or this. And so, you know, the best way to do that was to just completely tear up all of the rules and constraints on me. It was also, I mean, I definitely pushed back when it, you know, if I do write about India, where people say, oh, of course, this is gonna, you know, something like this will happen in India. This is actually as much based on my experience growing up in the United States and about being, you know, reading about other parts of the world. So, you know, there is something unfortunately universal about like intimate relationships being constrained and foreclosed on by the larger political landscape. So it was, I think it was a deliberate pushback, and I didn't want to be in a position where I'm like, you know, trying to defend my rights or to push back and say, this isn't about all Indians, you know, that kind of thing. Like, I wanted to, I think I wanted to liberate my characters from any of these expectations of what I should be saying about Americans or Indians or, you know, people from any part of the world. So that work is now on the reader, that you know, you have to be able to break yourself out of this idea of these are who Indians are, this is what Americans are, and, you know, just deal with these individual characters, I guess.
Yeah, no, I was curious because after this novel, when you look at the world around us right now, the US or India, Pakistan, do you feel like it's a little bit scarily predictive, I suppose? Or
yes, I do. The short answer is yes. You know, one part of the world I was looking at when I was writing the novel was Syria, and just how quickly things can change. You know, you think that something's not going to happen here, that, you know, the unthinkable can't happen, and then it does, and then, you know, suddenly you're a refugee, suddenly you have to find a way out. And you know, even though I had sort of an abstract idea of that from reading about, you know, reading about Syria at the time, that this would become so acute for so much of the world, and then that kind of government and repressive apparatus would become such a big part of the landscape here, where, you know, many different groups and people are being demonized and made very vulnerable by the government that's in power right now. I don't think I was completely prepared for that. I wasn't, you know, I'll say I was surprised. I wasn't expecting it as much as I had written about it, and did know that it could happen anywhere. You know, I hope maybe I'll write a predictive book where there's peace on earth, and that will come to fruition.
Okay, so in one of your old interviews, you've talked about the idea of inserting our stories into the American folklore and mythology, and does it matter? What are your thoughts on that? I would sort of like to hear if you do think it matters.
I mean, I definitely think it matters. And, you know, part of why I wanted to write my second novel was it was about inserting my experience, you know, not that the novel is biographical, but the experience of people like me who came as immigrants in the late 60s, early 70s from a country that, you know, most people here did not care about, had not heard of. And you're growing up in this environment where, you know, you're not allowed to be American. You're not really from this other country, but and you're being immersed in this culture and this literature where, you know, it gets into your heart, right? It becomes a part of you, but then you don't see yourself in it, and the rest of the country doesn't see you as part of that history, as part of that tradition. So I really think it is important for writers here to insert themselves into Americana, I guess, American literature, the idea of Americanness, not as some kind of patriotic project, because I'm not a patriot, and I don't really actually, at this point, I don't believe in nationalism. Like I feel my connection is with all of humanity, not a particular nation, not a particular flag. But as far as a cultural project, I think it's very important for writers of all different backgrounds to say, this is American literature, this is an American story, and all Americans should read it. One of the things I think is a problem, a huge problem, which has brought us to this moment, is that Black literature is seen mainly as being for Black people, Black children, you know, or Black, you know, youth to read and get some kind of sense of identity, rather than that this is a literature for us to understand American history. And, you know, we don't say that about white people's literature. You know, we don't, everyone's supposed to read that. But when it's literature by these minority groups, that's for those people. This is, I think, a very damaging and very dangerous conception. I think that we have to have an orientation that we want to fully understand the history of this country and fully understand, you know, what this country is about, fully understand these people. And one of the main ways you do that is through reading fiction and through reading poetry and reading memoirs. And we need to get a full picture, you have to read about immigrants from Central America, from South America, from Mexico. You have to read about Native Americans. You have to read about Black Americans. You have to read about immigrants from Asia and South Asia, and you know, read about white people too. So Um, I just think that it's very important for us to break out of this idea that any particular literature is only for a particular set of people, and that other people outside of those groups can't understand and can't connect with that experience. So
So how can one, as maybe as an artist, or is this something that has to be systemic, like you have to add more sort of publishers of color? Like where is the possible solution to this?
mhm. I mean, I think for our part, it's mainly through the conversations that we inject into, so conversations like this, but conversations that we inject into the field, whether it's through our writing essays, or open letters or whatever. I do think that um, the publishing industry has to change, and I I do think that we do need more publishers of color and publishers from different marginalized backgrounds. But I think the main thing is that we have to really deepen the debate and deepen the conversation on what are we doing with this? Why is all of this literature important? What's the effect of it on society, and where are we trying to go? What kind of world are we trying to create? That's I know, like, I don't expect all writers to like be preoccupied with that, but it is my preoccupation. So for my part, I feel like my contribution is to really ask hard questions and have a debate that spreads throughout our industry. But I don't really think of it as an industry, right? It's through a debate that spreads all over, about what's the value of literature and what's the value of having this story be part of that large canon of work.
I did want to ask you actually, so could you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are, what your sort of life trajectory has been like?
Yeah, so I came to the US when I was 2 years old. We lived mainly in upstate New York and then moved to Pennsylvania. So I mainly grew up out in a suburb of Philadelphia. And this was at a time when there were not many Indian immigrants around me. And I also, there weren't that many people of color. And so I grew up hearing a lot of, every racial slur was directed at me. So, because nobody knew what race we were actually. So, I think that definitely made me think about race from an early age. And then I'd always written. I started writing stories, I think, in 5th or 6th grade. I never thought that I would become a writer, but it was always one way that I coped with the things that were going on around me. And then I went to college. I became a elementary school teacher. So I moved to New York and I became a public school teacher, but it was at a really interesting time in the mid to late 90s in New York, where for the first time I was surrounded by people that were like me, who had come to this country as young people and grew up sort of on the margins, but sort of also in the mainstream, and then converged on this scene in New York of a lot of progressive South Asians from different backgrounds. And there was this real ferment of activity and art and activism and politics. So I met artists of all different kinds of artists. I worked with the South Asian Women's Creative Collective, and I actually credit that scene with actually giving me the the determination to keep writing and to get published. So we used to have salons, you know, once a month, once or twice a month, and people would present their artwork. And that was the first time I presented my writing. And I was also one of the founding members of South Asians Against Police Brutality, because this was at a time too when these instances of police murder and repression just were coming like one after the other. And maybe that had been the case before I moved to New York, but almost as soon as I moved to New York, the case of Anthony Baez was in the news. He was killed in a chokehold for his football hitting a cop's car, you know, just for nothing. Abner Louima had been, a Haitian immigrant, had been raped by police. And then Amadou Diallo shot 41 times. So just case after case, and as a show of solidarity and to say, you know, this is unacceptable, we formed a group and would go to all of the police brutality protests with our banner. And it really meant a lot to people to see that this group of, you know, this group that not a lot of people still knew about, that there was this force of South Asian people who were taking a stand for social justice. That was really, I think it meant a lot to people, especially Black people, who were really at the forefront of that struggle. And so there was just a swirl of so much going on in music. Asian Dub Foundation came to New York, and I had had a little literature politics table at that concert. And, you know, you had a sense too that this was a global thing, like the South Asian diaspora in Canada and the UK, and here, that there was this forging of something that was really on a global scale. So it was very exciting, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote. I got my MFA at Hunter in 2005, and then I said, okay, I've had enough of New York. I'm done. And I got into a car and I left, and I ended up in Texas, where actually I think things just really opened up for me as a writer. I don't know if I needed to get out of that swirl in New York, where everything was happening and you were like at a frenetic pace all the time. And I came here and I was able to write my novel and able to write stories that were getting published. And so a lot changed for me when I got here.
Do you think in the situation, such as the political situation as it is right now, or the state of things, that it is a radical act just to be hopeful? Because you sound pretty hopeful about the world, and you're, you know, despite how things are and despite the kind of things that you speak up about. And I definitely see on social media and in our conversation just now that you have hope. And certainly I think one keeps trying only when one has hope. So I do wonder if you consider that a radical act, just hoping.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a radical act to not give up on humanity, which, you know, there's a lot of cynicism out there, but that cynicism is, you know, it just becomes an excuse to you know, just retreat, I guess. I mean, I am hopeful, but the hope is based on what I see people doing. I think it is a radical act to hope, but you have to fight for that. You have to fight for that hope to become something that's not just a pipe dream, but that can actually change the world, that can actually change the situation, which the situation right now is dire. You know, the American West is on fire. At a time when actually the future of humanity really is on the line. I guess it's a combination of hope and looking squarely at reality. I don't think you can have hope unless you actually look at reality, look at what's happening, and then look at, okay, who's working to change these things? Who is actually, putting out ideas that can change the course of history. I think people have, as a teacher, one thing I could say is that the way that humanities has been, as a discipline, has been just eroded over decades, has really affected the way even progressive people, even educated people, see their role in the world, where they don't think that people themselves have anything to do with whether history goes in one direction or another. And imagine if that was the attitude when, in South Asia, they were fighting for their independence. Imagine if that was the attitude during the, before the Civil War, when, you had however many people who were enslaved in this country. I mean, there just seems to be this complete learned helplessness. And I do think it has a little bit to do with the way the education system has been in the last 2 decades of just, teach to the test, teach to the test. It's not exact. There's no really understanding of history and what makes history pivot, what makes it change. It's not just the people at the top doing what they're doing. It's people, like you and me, people, or, people with even less than us who decide to act. And so I think that's where my hope comes from. I've been reading, I see people who are acting, who are, I think we can see it in the June and July, millions of people participated in these Black Lives Matter protests. And it changed the conversation like that. So, I'm not saying that it's completely like people are beyond redemption if they haven't, figured out that, people getting into the streets can change things. But, I think overall, especially in the millions of people in this country who really don't like what's going on with Trump, but they don't see that they have any role in changing it except to vote, which I'm going to vote. I think that's important. But if we're only relying on voting while this guy is stealing the election right now, then we're going to be screwed. So, but I am hopeful, and I think that it is a radical act of hope, and I do challenge people to be hopeful, but not just be hopeful like I'm going to sit here and it's going to resolve itself. It's not. You're going to have to step into it somehow. And if millions of people do that, then there's hope. Yeah.
Well, that's a lovely note, I think, to end this conversation on. Thank you so much. There's
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
so much more to discuss.